Disclaimer: NES Works episode 113 does not advocate the wanton murder of children and teenagers.
Prove to the court that I am sentient.
This is absurd.
From one of the best on NES last week with Ninja Gaiden, we go to one of the worst on NES with Friday the 13th, right? Everything about Friday the 13th screams, stay away. For starters, there's that LJN logo on the box, a blaring warning sign in hindsight, but one that would have given any savvy game enthusiast cause for pause even back in the day. The worst was yet to come for this company as of early '89, but even here, they've hardly been without sin. As usual for LJN, Friday the 13th traces its origins not back to an arcade classic or a vintage computer title, but rather to a media property. One need only think back to Karate Kid and TNC Surf Design to suffer post-traumatic flashbacks that scream, stay clear. And, once again, LJN has roped in a little-known Japanese development studio to perform the heavy lifting on this project for them. Before long, LJN would shift its hiring to European and Australian studios like Rare, Software Creations, and Beam. But Western developers had only just begun to realize that Nintendo was not some passing fad, and had started scrambling to get a handle on the hardware by this point. So LJN still favored the more experienced Japanese subcontractors. Unfortunately, in this case, LJN seemingly turned to Atlus again, although as the Game Developer Research Institute notes, pinning down the precise identity of LJN's ghost developers is no simple task, since many of their games demonstrate signs of having been worked on by known contributors to multiple different studios. And it's not like these games had any in-game credits, even if you could somehow finish them. However, it is known that in the company's early days, LJN relied heavily on Atlus. Atlus, in turn, often double outsourced those projects to subcontractors like Westone. Bear in mind that Atlus was more or less a total nobody at the time, occasionally producing somewhat notable works like Megami Tensei and Zezig's for other publishers, but mostly just scraping by with works for hire. In a way, they helped to pioneer the give-and-take existence of independent dev studios, sinking time into substantial, meaningful works while keeping the lights on by accepting rapid churn works for hire. Friday the 13th falls squarely into the latter category. Based on a successful American film franchise, the game loosely adapts the events of the silver screen story into something digestible in 8-bit video game form. Like Jaws before it, Friday the 13th had been around long enough and had made its way into enough international markets that we can safely assume that the Japan-based developers on this NES cartridge would have had some passing familiarity with the source material even before embarking on the game project, which is certainly more than you can say for Gacha. I'm not sure that made their job any easier though. How do you translate an R-rated slasher film where the villain murders just about every named character into a video game? More to the point, how do you translate a movie that mostly involves teenagers getting murdered while having sex in the woods into an action game that works within the technical limitations of the NES and also manages to be in any way appropriate for the NES's core audience of latchkey tweens? If anyone could solve this puzzle, it would be Atlus. The company had just adapted a light novel about using computers to summon demons into a very successful role-playing game for Namco. I mean, everything about the original Megami Tensei for Famicom seems to have teed up Atlus for a masterpiece here. Like Friday the 13th, the original work, Digital Devil Story: Resurrection of the Goddess by Aya Nishitani, centered around horny teenagers in the present day fighting to survive against uncanny forces driven by a resentful outcast. Shift Megami Tensei from 1980s Tokyo to a lakeside summer camp in the American woods, and convert the drawn-to-life figures from world mythology to a raggedy man in a hockey mask, and you have a damn good template for Friday the 13th, the video game. Naturally, this is the furthest thing from the approach Atlus actually ended up taking, though in fairness, that's probably because LJN would have lost their minds if Atlus had tried to foist a dungeon crawler RPG onto tender young American audiences. Still, despite its limitations, the NES could easily have created a game that conveyed the atmosphere and spookiness of the Friday the 13th films, right? We just saw last episode that in the hands of a clever illustrator, the NES's limited color palette and resolution could be wrangled into presenting some brilliantly moody spaces. Ninja Gaiden contrasted the NES's oddball color options against walls of black to depict creepy, organic, otherworldly spaces and characters every bit as eerie as the tensest moments of the film Aliens. Atlus could easily have adopted a similar approach here. Tecmo showed off Ninja Ryu Kenden nearly a year before its debut, tipping their hand to competitors and giving Atlus plenty of time to yoink those principles with the same vigor that Kung Fu Heroes lifted sound effects and mechanics from Super Mario Bros. But again, that in no way resembles the Friday the 13th that we did get. After the promising start of an opening screen that involves a dagger flying brutally into the eye hole of Jason's hockey mask, the game shifts into basically the exact opposite of anything you might possibly expect to find in a game about Friday the 13th films. No, once Friday the 13th opens, you receive a cryptic message that exhorts you to light fireplaces before being told to select one of 6 camp counselors, and then you're off to the races. The game drops you into what appears to be something akin to a Castlevania 2 or Rygar-style adventure, a free-roaming side-scroller where zombies and other creatures constantly beset you, and you can either jump over them or destroy them by throwing rocks. And the colors! Rather than creating a moody setting drenched in shadowy chiaroscuro, Atlus went all in on presenting the world and monsters of Crystal Lake in late 80s appropriate day-glow colors. There is no subtlety here, just a sort of vivid neon pop art in which even Jason himself is rendered in shades of lavender and robin's egg blue. And not for the title screen, you'd honestly never guess that this is a game about Friday the 13th. It comes off more as a parody of the film, akin to Splatterhouse spin-off Wanpaku Graffiti. Not that American kids in 1989 had any idea what a parody game was, of course. Even more baffling is the gameplay itself. While the immediate threat posed by the endless waves of zombies emerging from the ground scans well, and falls naturally into the fight-or-flight methodology of 8-bit action games, Atlus's Friday the 13th wastes no time whatsoever in hitting you with bizarre existential threats. After a few seconds of gameplay, you hear a warning sound, and see a countdown begin in the status bar at the top of the screen, relaying the fact that you have 60 seconds to do something. If you fail to outrace this timer, which of course will be the case the first time you play, given that the threat is so vague and untelegraphed, you'll notice that one of the counselor icons in the status bar disappears. A moment later, it happens again. Or, worse, a countdown may begin to tick down next to the word kids. Allowing this to hit 0 will reduce the count of campers. Once you're out of campers and counselors, your chosen protagonist will inevitably die, and it's game over. This is a terrible game experience, opaque, inscrutable, unapologetic, and generally just not fun. Understandably, the general consensus at the time treated it as such. Nintendo Power barely gave it a nod, relegating it to a terse video shorts feature in its 4th issue, and following up with a page of tips and explanations 3 issues later just to deal with all the help requests that they kept receiving from confused children. When contemporary publications did bother to acknowledge Friday the 13th's existence, it almost invariably happened with a contemptuous undertone. Electronic Gaming Monthly's first ever Year-End Game Awards named it the worst movie to game for 1989. Friday the 13th helped cement LJN's reputation as the dregs of the NES ecosystem among collectors, and years later, internet humorists like Sean Baby and the Angry Video Game Nerd would bag on it, effectively canonizing it as absolute trash beneath contempt. Friday the 13th, to put it in a word, sucks. And on the whole, I don't disagree with this consensus. This is a mess of a game, one that makes weird creative choices and imposes a lot of unreasonable expectations on players. But it's a different kind of bad game than something like the weird slop we saw in the early Famicom boom days. It's the ambitious kind of mess, the sort that fails not because it's poorly programmed by unskilled programmers, but rather the sort that fails because its creators wanted to do too much with too little. I mentioned Weston's Jaws earlier, and that game actually turns out to be the best point of reference here. Friday the 13th for NES follows in the footsteps of high-minded movie adaptations like Jaws, or like E.T. and Raiders of the Lost Ark for Atari 2600. Games whose creators didn't settle for some simple slapdash hack job, but really tried to engage with the source material in a meaningful way, and whose efforts ultimately fizzled out due to a rushed publication schedule. Although I don't know that anyone has ever discussed Friday the 13th with the creatives behind its development, we do have some insight into LJN's contractual systems thanks to HG 101's interview with Weston's Ryuichi Nishizawa. Namely, he said that his studio had 8 weeks in which to hammer out and ship Jaws. Despite that shockingly brief deadline, Westone produced a multi-format, proto-role-playing game with leveling mechanics, a simple economy, and a free-roaming world where random encounters could besiege explorers. Friday the 13th appears to be something of a similar situation. Atlas, or whoever subcontracted for them, could have turned Friday the 13th into a simple Pac-Man-like maze chase. Rote, but thematically appropriate. They could have made it a simple platform action game in the style of Super Mario Bros., where a counselor runs and jumps through the woods collecting acorns for extra lives, or facing an oversized Jason boss at the end of each world. The highly compressed development timelines that companies like LJN imposed on their contractors lent itself to these formulaic approaches. But no, instead, Friday the 13th is a sprawling, weirdly elaborate game, packed with systems and secrets. It adopts the basic form of Goonies 2 or Dr. Chaos. Run and jump action in a branching, free-roaming, self-contained side-scrolling world, paired with first-person adventure scenes inspired by dungeon crawlers or, more likely, by post-Portopia detective mystery games. And it doesn't do a bad job with any of these, shockingly enough. The side-scrolling sequences are programmed competently, with responsive controls and crisp visuals that minimize the amount of unfair, untelegraphed damage you have to accept. That's certainly more than you can say for Dr. Chaos. On top of that, the 6 different playable counselors all play a little differently from one another. Some can leap higher or throw rocks faster than others. Nothing drastic, but it does mean that certain counselors are more important to protect than others. Meanwhile, the first-person sequences don't simply stop at static screen-by-screen views. Instead, they integrate a small degree of character movement, technically functioning as third-person behind-the-shoulder scenes, not first-person, and they try to create the sensation of moving into and around interior spaces. The environmental animation can't even begin to compare to the dungeon mode in Phantasy Star for Master System, which had shipped in the US a couple of months earlier. But honestly, this and Golgo 13 Top Secret Episode have the most convincing 3D immersive animation we've seen to date on NES. And all of this takes place in a camp in the woods that players can freely explore. Crystal Lake consists of a circular, Simon's Quest-like loop of side-scrolling ground with branches that lead into the woods and spaces you can only reach by boat. It's not a big place, but there's enough sprawl to it that making your way from one end of the camp to the other in an emergency can generate a real sensation of anxiety and desperation. The interior zones, cabins and caves, appear throughout the camp and generally serve as your destinations for critical events. You can check your location and your current crisis destination at any time by checking the in-game map, which neatly lines up with the actual layout of the side-scrolling spaces. And to top it all off, the entire game operates in real time. Friday the 13th, which really should be called Friday the 13th Part 3, since, like Jaws, this game is based more on the contemporary third entry in its film franchise, takes place over the course of 3 days. You can track the way time advances pretty easily, since it incorporates a day-night cycle. This flows a bit more smoothly than the one in Simon's Quest. Rather than nights suddenly falling and doubling the strength of enemies, the sky changes in color over time until the sun is set. You need to survive all 3 days by protecting both campers and counselors alike from Jason Voorhees, the inevitable boogeyman who seeks to murder everyone in camp. This is more easily said than done, since Jason also operates in real time. His role in the game might remind you of the roaming SA-X in Metroid Fusion, but he's actually much more difficult to deal with. Jason moves consistently through the camp, rather than warping magically from place to place. But from what I can tell, the point where he starts, the exact route he takes, and the placement of friendly characters throughout the camp varies from playthrough to playthrough. Rather than facing Jason in scripted encounters, you need to track and react to the way his actions play out in each session. In a lot of ways, Friday the 13th does work like Jaws, with the villain roaming in the background and soaking up an unusual amount of punishment. Even if you manage to defeat Jason in the first day, he comes back to life each morning, and somewhere along the way, you have to fight his mother too, in the tradition of Psycho and Beowulf. And that's not even getting into all the hidden systems, like the way you can upgrade each counselor's weapons by defeating enemies, pass your gear along to other kids when you swap out the active character, or use lit fireplaces as fast travel warps. Friday the 13th has a lot going on, and much of it does not make itself immediately apparent to the player at first glance. The game's complexity works both for and against it. For patient players, Friday the 13th proves to be a fascinating onion whose layers beg to be peeled back and discovered. But you kind of have to want to love the game to take the time to actually discover all these mechanics. And unfortunately, the actual process of play really bogs down the whole thing. The action in Friday the 13th may work more smoothly than in something like Dr. Chaos, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. The outset of the game seems reasonable, as your camp counselor can easily toss stones at zombies to take them out. But over time, monsters appear more frequently and quickly overwhelm you unless you manage to acquire better weapons than mere stones. Now, the first weapon upgrade, a dagger, appears readily enough. Kill 5 zombies, and it appears as a power-up right there for you to collect. But the more effective weapons, not to mention things like the sweater, which works like armor, require you to perform far more arcane actions before they'll appear. And if your current counselor dies in action without passing those upgrades along to someone, the next kid in line has to start from zero. The real problem here is Jason himself, which of course makes sense. He's the serial killer that terrorizes the innocent and not so innocent teens of Crystal Lake. Of course he's insanely difficult to defeat. Jason has a ridiculous amount of health, with a huge life bar and so much defensive power that it takes multiple hits of most weapons to whittle down even a single point of his health. And you always have to face him once you reach the current alert location. He moves from cabin to cabin, stalking victims, and you have only a short time to navigate to that cabin and interfere. But facing off against Jason in a cabin plays out like the world's worst Punch-Out clone, where you have to stab and slash Jason while dodging his knife attacks. Attack more easily said than done, since he moves twice as fast as you, is twice your size, and hits about 20 times as hard. I guess it's theoretically possible to survive these encounters, but I think I'm just too old and slow to manage it at this point. Hence my use of invincibility cheats in some of this footage. Fittingly, defeating Jason appears to be a task best left to teens. You can also confront Jason in the side-scrolling scenes, which is slightly less impossible than the cabin encounters. He throws blades at you, but the platforming controls are responsive enough that you stand a better chance of dodging here than you do in the interior adventure scenes. Jason will usually run off after a few seconds, but because he moves in real time in a linear path through the camp, you can actually catch up with him again once he does, and his health meter remains impacted by the damage you managed to inflict in your previous face-offs. But again, it does feel wildly unbalanced against you. The prospect of actually seeing Friday the 13th through to the end, let alone a successful end, stands as one of the more daunting tasks of the NES library. One of those projects that really makes you feel for the Mexican runner, you know? Friday the 13th clearly needed more time for its big, inventive concepts to properly come together into a good game. Atlas, or whoever, swung big here, in the tradition of Howard Scott Warshaw. And just as with his bold efforts on 2600, the realities of timing and budgets that come hand in hand with licensed properties, like this, ultimately undermine their work. Elements of Friday the 13th would appear more effectively in later games, like the Wandering Monster with a persistent life meter, think Final Fantasy VI, or the day-night cycle, or the idea of fast travel, or the concept of multiple characters with different skills and independent life meters, or, well, the point is, Friday the 13th was ahead of the curve in some ways. It's one of the most impressive disasters of a game ever to appear on NES, and that counts for something. I'm just not sure what.
Next time on NES Works, the only kind of madness that doesn't involve losing your marbles.